The year is 1895. An old man sits on his porch in the fading light of a Virginia evening, watching the sun sink behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. His name is Ethan Blackwell, and though his beard has turned white and his hands shake with age, his eyes still hold the fierce determination of a man who once stood against the world. Beside him sits his grandson Daniel, 12 years old, carefully sharpening a hunting knife under his grandfather's watchful gaze. The boy works with concentration, the steel singing against the whetstone in a steady rhythm that has lulled many evenings into peaceful silence. But tonight, Daniel breaks that silence with a question that has been burning in his young mind. "Grandfather," he says, pausing mid-stroke, "why do you always say a man must keep his promises no matter how hard it gets?" Ethan turns his weathered face toward the boy. The last rays of sunlight catch the deep scar that runs along his ribs, a permanent reminder of battles fought and nearly lost. He reaches for the worn leather journal beside him, its cover cracked and faded, the year 1865 stamped in gold that has long since tarnished. "Let me tell you about the year I turned 36, Ethan says, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades. "The year I learned what honor truly means." He opens the journal to a page marked with a dried wildflower, its petals still holding a ghost of their original purple. Daniel leans closer as his grandfather begins to read. September 14th, 1865. "Today I found her by the river, blood soaking through her habit. I didn't know that saving her would change everything." The old man's eyes drift closed, and when he speaks again, his voice carries the strength of his younger self, pulling them both back through the corridors of time. 3 months had passed since the war ended. The country was broken, bleeding from wounds that would take generations to heal. In the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, Ethan Blackwell worked his small farm with the same stubborn determination his father had taught him. The land had been in the Blackwell family since 1848. 120 acres of good soil nestled in a valley where the mountains kept watch like silent guardians. But Ethan no longer worked the land alone. 2 years earlier, his wife Catherine had died, bringing their second child into the world. The baby, a daughter, had lived only 3 hours before following her mother into whatever lay beyond. Now it was just Ethan and his son Benjamin, 10 years old, learning to be a man too soon. On that particular morning, father and son worked side by side mending a section of fence that had been damaged in a summer storm. Ethan showed Benjamin how to split oak planks with a hand-forged wedge, how to set them deep enough to withstand winter frost, how to drive iron nails with 3 precise strikes of the hammer. "A fence is more than wood and nails," Ethan told his son, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's a promise that what's inside is worth protecting." Benjamin nodded, his young face serious with concentration as he hammered a nail into place. The boy had his mother's green eyes and her gentle spirit, though Ethan worked hard to temper that gentleness with the strength a man needed to survive in this hard world. They had just finished the repair when riders appeared on the road. 3 men on horseback led by Judge Nathaniel Crane, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness had grown considerably since the war's end. The judge sat tall in his saddle, his black coat immaculate, despite the dust of travel, his silver-topped cane resting across his lap like a scepter of authority. "Good morning, Blackwell," Crane called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a snake preparing to strike. "Might we have a word?" Ethan straightened instinctively, moving to place himself between the riders and his son. "Judge Crane, what brings you out this way?" Crane dismounted with the stiff movements of a man unused to physical labor. He pulled a rolled document from his saddlebag, the official seal of the county court visible even from a distance. "I'm afraid there's been a complication regarding your land," Crane said, unrolling the paper. "It seems there's another claim to this property. A prior claim, actually, that predates your family's ownership." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. "That's impossible. My father bought this land legally in 1848. I have the deed locked in my house, signed and sealed." "I'm sure you do," Crane replied smoothly. "But unfortunately, in the chaos following the war, many documents have come to light that were previously overlooked. This claim comes from a church organization that held title to much of this valley before the war. They are prepared to be reasonable, of course. They understand you have made improvements to the land. They're willing to allow you to purchase it again at a fair price." "Fair price," Ethan's voice remained steady, but Benjamin could see his father's hands curling into fists. "This is my land, Judge, bought and paid for. I won't be extorted." One of the men behind Crane, a lean figure with dead eyes and a gun worn low on his hip, shifted in his saddle. Ethan recognized him from the previous week, one of the men who had accompanied Crane on his rounds through the valley, pressuring farmers to sign over portions of their land. His name was Marcus Webb. Crane's smile never wavered. No one's talking about extortion, Blackwell. This is simply a legal matter. The law is changing in these post-war times. I'm offering you a chance to resolve this peacefully. The church is asking $3,000. I suggest you take it. Ethan's mind worked quickly. His father had paid $240 for this land in 1848, $2 per acre. The current market value was perhaps $600 to $800 for the entire farm. $3,000 was robbery with paperwork. And if I don't, Ethan asked, then the law will take its course. You have 30 days to vacate the property or present your case in court. Crane paused, his eyes sliding toward Benjamin. I'd hate to see a boy lose his home, especially one who's already lost his mother. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Ethan took a step forward, and Benjamin saw something dangerous flash in his father's eyes. Something the boy had never seen before. Get off my land, Ethan said quietly, and don't come back unless you want to test how well I can still shoot. Crane's smile finally faded. He rolled up the document and tucked it back into his saddlebag with deliberate slowness. You're making a mistake, Blackwell. A very serious mistake. As the men turned to leave, Marcus Webb leaned down from his saddle, speaking just loud enough for Ethan to hear. Reverend Stone doesn't like people who don't cooperate. And when the Reverend doesn't like someone, they tend to have accidents. Sometimes their kids do too. Ethan's hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the fence post, but the riders were already spurring their horses down the road, dust rising in their wake. Benjamin stood frozen, his small hammer still clutched in one hand. Papa, what's happening? Are they going to take our farm? Ethan knelt down, placing his large calloused hands on his son's shoulders. Listen to me, son. Do you remember what I taught you about honor? You said honor means doing what's right even when it's hard. That's exactly right. This land is ours. It belonged to your grandfather, and now it belongs to us. No piece of paper is going to change that. And a man doesn't run from bullies no matter how powerful they think they are. But what if they come back? Ethan pulled his son close, and in that embrace, Benjamin felt both protection and promise. Then we'll stand our ground together. That night, after Benjamin had gone to bed, Ethan sat alone at the rough-hewn table where he and Catherine had shared countless meals. He poured himself a small measure of whiskey, old Overholt rye, and stared at the deed to his land. The paper was yellowed with age, but the seal was clear, the signatures unmistakable. He thought about Judge Crane's words about this Reverend Stone he'd mentioned. The name wasn't unfamiliar. There had been whispers in the valley about a man who ran the St. Helena's convent and orphanage in the hills north of Harrisonburg. Whispers about children who disappeared, about money that flowed in mysterious directions, about connections to powerful men in Richmond. But whispers were just whispers. Ethan was a farmer, not a crusader. He had a son to raise and a farm to protect. Whatever darkness existed beyond his fence line was not his concern. Not yet. The next morning dawned clear in cold autumn, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Ethan woke Benjamin before first light, and together they set out for the river with their hunting rifles. The boy carried his father's old 12-gauge shotgun, a weapon almost too heavy for his young arms, but one he'd been learning to handle since he turned 8. We need meat for winter, Ethan explained as they walked through the pre-dawn darkness. 3 deer at least, maybe 4 if we're lucky. They made their way through familiar woods, past the old oak, where Catherine had loved to sit and read, past the creek where they caught trout in summer, following a game trail that led down to the Shenandoah River. Ethan taught as they walked, pointing out the tracks of deer and turkey, showing Benjamin how to read the forest signs. A deer steps light, he explained, needling by a set of prints in the soft earth. See how shallow these are. He pointed to deeper, wider impressions. Bear, big one too, probably heading down from the high country for winter. Benjamin studied the tracks carefully. And people leave the clearest signs of all. We're heavy, clumsy. We break branches, leave deep prints. Ethan paused, his eyes narrowing. And sometimes we leave blood. They had come around a bend in the trail, and there scattered across the riverbank were unmistakable signs of violence. The grass was trampled, in a wide circle, branches broken and leading down to the water's edge, a trail of dark stains that could only be one thing. Ethan raised his hand, signaling Benjamin to stop. He moved forward slowly, rifle ready, every sense alert for danger. The trail led to a sandbar where the river curved, and there, half in and half out of the water, lay a figure in black. "Stay back," Ethan commanded. But Benjamin had already seen. Even at his young age, he recognized the shape of a woman's body, the distinctive habit of a nun now torn and soaked with river water and blood. Ethan knelt beside her, checking for a pulse with fingers that had seen their share of death during the war. For a long moment, he was certain she was gone. Then he felt it faint as butterfly wings, a heartbeat struggling to continue. "She's alive," he said, and the words seemed to surprise him. "Benjamin, run back to the house. Bring the wagon and blankets, fast as you can." The boy hesitated for only a second before sprinting back up the trail. Ethan turned his attention to the woman. She was young, maybe 22 or 23. Her face was pale beneath the bruises. Her back, visible through the torn fabric of her habit, bore the marks of a savage whipping, easily 15 or 20 lashes that had cut deep into the flesh. Her wrists showed rope burns, raw and bleeding where she'd been bound. One eye was swollen shut, and when Ethan gently lifted her head, he found a gash along her scalp that had bled freely before clotting. He tore strips from his own shirt, wadding them against the worst of the wounds. As he worked, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and filled with terror. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her hands scrambled weakly against the sand, trying to push herself away. "Easy now," Ethan said softly, the same tone he'd used with frightened animals. "I'm not going to hurt you. But you need help." The woman's eyes darted around, wildly searching for escape. Ethan carefully moved back, giving her space, keeping his hands visible and empty. "My name is Ethan Blackwell. My son's gone to fetch a wagon. We'll take you somewhere safe." At the word safe, something broke in the woman's eyes. Tears began to flow, cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. She whispered, her voice raw. "No, doctor. They'll find me. They'll kill me if they find me." "Who will find you? Reverend Stone, St. Helena's? They'll kill me if they find me." The name sent a chill down Ethan's spine. The same name Judge Crane had mentioned. The same darkness whispered about in the valley. "What did they do to you?" The woman tried to speak, but pain overtook her. She gasped, clutching at her ribs, and Ethan saw more bruises there, the distinctive pattern of boot prints. "Don't talk," he said. "Save your strength. I give you my word, no one's going to hurt you while you're under my protection." It was a promise made without thought, without understanding the weight it would carry. But it was a promise nonetheless, and Ethan Blackwell did not break his word. Benjamin returned with the wagon in less than 20 minutes, the horse lathered with sweat from the hard run. Together, father and son lifted the woman as gently as they could, though each movement brought gasps of pain. Ethan wrapped her in every blanket they'd brought, trying to ward off the shock that was setting in. On the ride back, the woman drifted in and out of consciousness. In her fevered moments, she muttered names and fragments of sentences. "Emma, little Emma, they're going to sell her. The babies. Oh God, the babies." Benjamin looked at his father with frightened eyes, but Ethan just shook his head. Whatever demons this woman was fighting, they would have to wait until she was strong enough to explain. At the farmhouse, Ethan carried her to the small bedroom that had once belonged to Catherine. The room still held her things, her dresses hanging in the wardrobe, her books on the shelf. He laid the injured woman on the bed and sent Benjamin to heat water. What followed were hours of careful, painful work. Ethan had learned basic medical care during the war, watching the surgeons work, helping to hold down screaming men while bullets were dug from their flesh. Catherine had expanded that knowledge, teaching him what she'd learned as a volunteer nurse. He cleaned each wound with water boiled to sterilization, then with whiskey when the water wasn't enough. The woman bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming as he worked. 3 of the deeper lashes on her back needed stitching, and Ethan did it with the same patient care he used to mend torn leather harness, though his hands shook more than he would ever admit. Benjamin helped, proving himself steady despite his young age. He held the lamp past bandages, never flinching, even when the blood ran freely. Ethan felt a fierce pride watching his son seeing the man he was becoming. When the worst was done, when the wounds were cleaned and bandaged, and the woman was resting under clean quilts, Ethan finally allowed himself to sit. He found Benjamin in the main room, sitting at the table with his head in his hands. "You did good today, son. Real good." Benjamin looked up, and there were tears on his cheeks. Who would do that to someone who would hurt a woman like that? I don't know, but we're going to find out. As if in answer to his words, there came a heavy pounding at the door. Ethan instinctively reached for his rifle, motioning Benjamin to stay back. Through the window, he could see three men on horseback, and one of them was the lean gunman who'd ridden with Judge Crane. Ethan opened the door just wide enough to see out, keeping the rifle visible. The man who stood on the porch was older, perhaps 45, with the build of someone who'd spent years doing hard labor. He wore a clerical collar, but there was nothing holy in his cold eyes. This, Ethan knew instinctively, was Marcus Webb, one of Reverend Stone's men. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, his voice flat. "We're looking for a dangerous criminal," Webb said. "A woman, a nun who attacked a priest and fled from St. Helena's convent. She's disturbed violent. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" "No, I've been hunting with my son all morning. Haven't seen anyone." Webb's eyes narrowed. "You're sure about that? Because if you're hiding her, that makes you an accomplice to assault on a man of God." "I said I haven't seen anyone. Now get off my property." "Mind if we look inside just to be sure?" Ethan raised the rifle an inch. "I mind very much. This is private property. You have no authority here." Webb smiled, a predator's expression. "I have the authority of the church and the law. Judge Crane himself signed the warrant. Then come back with Judge Crane and a proper search warrant. Until then, you're trespassing." For a moment, it seemed Webb might push the issue. His hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. But then Benjamin appeared behind his father, holding the 12-gauge shotgun with surprising steadiness. The boy's hands might have been shaking, but his aim was true, pointed directly at Webb's chest. Webb's eyes flicked between father and son, calculating odds. Finally, he stepped back. "You're making a mistake, Blackwell. Reverend Stone doesn't forgive those who interfere with the Lord's work. And I don't forgive men who threaten my family. We understand each other." Webb mounted his horse, but before riding off, he called back one more warning. "We'll be watching this place. She can't hide forever." After they left, Ethan locked the door and checked every window. Benjamin lowered the shotgun, his young face pale but determined. "Papa, what's happening?" Ethan knelt before his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Do you remember what I taught you about honor? Doing what's right even when it's hard?" Benjamin nodded slowly. "That woman in there, she's hurt and scared. She's running from bad men who want to hurt her more. If we turn her out, she dies. Do you understand that?" The boy nodded again. "So we have a choice. We can do the easy thing, the safe thing, and hand her over. Or we can do the right thing even though it's hard and dangerous. What do you think we should do?" Benjamin didn't hesitate. "We help her, like Mama would have wanted." Ethan pulled his son into a fierce embrace. "That's my boy. That's my brave boy." As night fell, the woman finally woke fully. Ethan sat beside the bed, a cup of water ready. She drank greedily, then fell back against the pillows, exhausted by even that small effort. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved my life. What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell." "Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment, Ethan thought she'd fallen asleep. But then she began to speak, and her words painted a picture of horror that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "I've been at St. Helena's convent for 10 years, she said. "Since I was 12, my parents died of influenza, and my little sister Emma and I had nowhere else to go. The church took us in. I became a novice, training to be a nun. Emma stayed in the orphanage." She paused, gathering strength. "At first it was bearable, strict but not cruel. But 5 years ago, Reverend Elijah Stone took over. He changed everything. The children, they stopped being children. They became commodities." "What do you mean?" Sarah's hands clenched the quilt. "He sells them. He and Judge Crane, they have a system. They find buyers, people who want cheap labor, who don't ask questions. They forge adoption papers, take the children away, and pocket the money. Some go to factories. Some to farms where they work like slaves. Some," her voice broke, "some disappear entirely." Ethan felt rage building in his chest like a fire. "How many?" "I don't know exactly. I saw the ledgers once by accident. Over 2,000 names in 15 years. 2,000 children sold like cattle." "And your sister," fresh tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks. "Emma is 8 now. 2 weeks ago, I heard Reverend Stone talking to a rich man from South Carolina. He was buying 5 children, and he wanted them young, fair-haired. Emma, Emma has blonde hair. Why did they hurt you? Sarah's voice hardened. I confronted Reverend Stone. I told him I knew what he was doing, that I would report him to the authorities. He laughed. He said he was the authorities, that Judge Crane would make sure no one believed a word I said. Then he ordered me whipped for insubordination. 50 lashes. They locked me in the cellar afterwards, said I'd be burned at dawn for witchcraft and attacking a priest. How did you escape? There was a loose stone in the cellar wall. I worked at it for hours until my fingers bled. I made it big enough to squeeze through, got into the tunnels beneath the convent. I came out in the woods and ran. I ran all night. They caught up to me at the river. I jumped in, let the current take me. I thought I was going to drown. She looked up at Ethan with desperate eyes. They still have Emma. They're going to sell her in 3 days. I have to save her, but I don't know how. I'm just one woman, and they have the law, the church, everything. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment, thinking about Benjamin, about what kind of man he wanted his son to become. He thought about Catherine, about what she would say if she were here. He already knew the answer. You're not alone anymore, he said quietly. I'll help you get your sister back. Why, boy? Sarah's voice was full of disbelief. You don't even know me. Why would you risk everything? My wife used to say something. She said when people stop helping each other, they stop being human. I don't want my son growing up in a world where good people do nothing because it's easier. He stood moving to the window to look out at the darkening valley. I'll ride to Harrisonburg tomorrow. Talk to Marshal Robert Hayes. He's a good man, honest. If we can get him on our side, we might have a chance. And if they come back here before you return, then Benjamin and I will hold them off. We've got enough ammunition for a long fight if it comes to that. But Sarah was shaking her head. You don't understand. Reverend Stone doesn't just have Webb and a few men. He has connections everywhere. Judges, sheriffs, powerful people in Richmond. He's been building this network for years. Then we'll need more than a marshal. We'll need evidence. You said you saw ledgers. Where are they? In a safe behind a painting of Christ in Blackwood's office. But it's locked and I don't know the combination. We'll worry about that later. First thing is keeping you alive and getting more help. Ethan left Sarah to rest and found Benjamin sitting on the porch in the darkness, the shotgun across his lap. The boy had appointed himself guard, and Ethan's heart swelled with pride and fear in equal measure. Go to bed, son. I'll take first watch. I'm not tired. Ethan sat beside him, and together they looked out at the valley bathed in moonlight. In the distance, they could see the lights of other farms, each one representing a family trying to survive in these uncertain times. Papa, Benjamin said finally, are we going to be okay? I don't know, son, but whatever happens, we'll face it together, and we'll face it knowing we did the right thing. Before they went inside, Ethan taught Benjamin one more lesson. He showed him how to load the rifles quickly, how to position himself for defense, where to aim if shooting became necessary. He prayed the boy would never need to use these skills. But hope and preparation were not the same thing. That night, Ethan barely slept. He sat in the darkness with his Springfield rifle across his lap, listening to every sound. Twice he thought he heard riders approaching, but it was only the wind moving through the trees. As dawn broke, he made his decision. He wrote a letter to Benjamin, simple words in case he didn't return. Son, I am doing what must be done. If I don't come back, remember this. Land can be lost, but honor never can if you hold on to it. Protect Miss Sarah. She is a good woman. I love you, your father. He saddled his horse and prepared to ride. Before leaving, he went to check on Sarah one more time. She was awake, sitting up, despite obvious pain. You said they still have your sister, Ethan said. I promise you this. If I'm still breathing, I will bring that little girl home. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Why are you doing this? Because Catherine would have, and I'm trying to be the man she thought I was. As Ethan rode out of the valley toward Harrisonburg, 15 miles of hard road ahead, he did not know that Judge Crane and Reverend Stone were already moving against him. He did not know that wanted posters with his name were being printed, offering $200 for his capture. He did not know that the decision to save one woman would set in motion events that would test everything he believed about justice, honor, and the kind of legacy a man leaves behind. All he knew was that he had given his word, and a man's word was all he truly owned in this world. Behind him in the small farmhouse, Sarah Mitchell whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. And young Benjamin Blackwell stood watch with a shotgun, learning, far too young, that sometimes being a man meant standing alone against the darkness. The sun rose higher, painting the valley in shades of gold. It was going to be a beautiful day, and by the time it ended, nothing would ever be the same. The road to Harrisonburg stretched long and dusty under the morning sun. Ethan pushed his horse hard, the animal's hooves throwing up clouds of red Virginia clay with each stride. The Springfield rifle rested across his saddle, loaded and ready, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. The town appeared on the horizon just after noon, its church steeple rising above the modest wooden buildings that lined Main Street. But something was wrong. As Ethan rode closer, he saw them. Papers tacked to every post and storefront, fluttering in the autumn breeze like warning flags. He dismounted near the general store, his gut tightening as he read the bold print. Wanted, Ethan Blackwell. Crime harboring a fugitive threatening officers of the law. Reward $200, by order of Judge Nathaniel Crane. $200, more than most men earned in a year. Enough to turn neighbors into enemies, friends into bounty hunters. Ethan calculated quickly. His farm brought in perhaps $150 annually in good years. This bounty was more than a year's honest labor. He pulled his hat low and moved quickly through the back streets toward the marshal's office. He'd known Robert Hayes since before the war, trusted him as much as he trusted any man. If anyone could help, it would be Hayes. The marshal's office sat at the edge of town, a squat building with iron bars on the windows. Ethan tied his horse around back and knocked on the rear door. 3 quick raps followed by 2 slow ones, an old signal from younger days. The door opened a crack and Hayes's lined face appeared. His eyes widened with recognition and concern. Ethan, Christ almighty, get inside before someone sees you. Hayes pulled him into the office and quickly locked the door. The marshal was 42 with a thick brown beard and a scar across his forehead from a Confederate saber that had nearly ended his life at Antietam. He'd been a good soldier and was an even better lawman. You know you're a wanted man, Hayes asked, moving to the window to check the street. I saw the posters. Tell me what's happening, and don't leave anything out. For the next 20 minutes, Ethan laid out everything. Sarah's story, the children, the ledgers, Judge Crane's involvement, Reverend Stone's network. Hayes listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When Ethan finished, the marshal poured them both whiskey from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer. This is bad, Ethan. Worse than bad. You're talking about bringing down some powerful men. I'm talking about stopping them from selling children like livestock. Hayes nodded slowly. I believe you, but belief isn't enough. I need evidence. Hard evidence. A woman's testimony, especially one they're calling a criminal, won't be enough. Not against Crane and Stone. The ledgers, Sarah said they're in Stone's office at the convent, which I can't search without a warrant. And guess who signs warrants in this county? Crane. Exactly. Hayes drained his whiskey and set the glass down with a sharp crack. But there might be another way. The federal courts in Richmond have jurisdiction over certain crimes. Human trafficking is one of them. If I can get evidence, I can bypass Crane entirely and take it straight to the federal prosecutors. Then we get the ledgers. Hayes raised an eyebrow. You're a wanted man, Ethan. If you're caught at that comment, I can't protect you. They'll hang you for assault on clergy before the sun sets. I made a promise to Sarah. I'm getting her sister back, and I'm getting those ledgers, with or without the law. The 2 men stared at each other across the desk. Finally, Hayes sighed and reached for his gun belt. Catherine would have my hide if I let you do this alone. We'll need help, though. Good men who can keep their mouths shut. I know 3 deputies who fought with us at Cedar Creek. They're solid. As Hayes sent word to gather his men, the door opened behind them. A woman entered wearing the plain black dress of a nun, though her veil hung loose around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. Marshal Hayes, her voice trembled. I need to speak with you about Sarah Mitchell. She turned to Ethan, recognition flashing across her face. You're the farmer. Sarah told me about you. Sister Margaret Walsh pulled a folded paper from her sleeve and handed it to Hayes. I've worked at St. Helena's for 8 years. I know what Reverend Stone is doing. I've known for years, and God forgive me, I've been too frightened to stop it. This is a list. 47 names, every child who's disappeared from St. Helena's in the last 5 years. I copied it from the ledger 3 nights ago. Ethan took the list, his hands shaking as he read the names. Mary O'Brien, 6 years old. Thomas Chen, 9. Rebecca White, 5. So many children. So many stolen lives. Why now? Hayes asked. Why come forward now? Margaret's voice broke. Because tomorrow they're taking Emma Mitchell. An auction house in Charleston paid $500 for her. $500 for an 8-year-old girl. She looked directly at Ethan. Sarah loved that child like her own daughter. When they whipped Sarah and locked her away, I wanted to help, but I was too afraid. Then she escaped, and I realized if she could be that brave, so could I. The ledgers, Ethan said urgently. Are they still in Stone's office? Yes, in the safe behind the painting of Christ. But there's more. Tonight, Stone is meeting with the buyer. A man named Thaddeus Harrow, a state senator from South Carolina. They're completing the transaction at an old hunting cabin 5 miles north of the convent. They're bringing the children there. Hayes leaned forward. How many children? 5. Emma and 4 others, all under 10. What time? 10 o'clock. Stone wants to move them out before dawn, before anyone notices they're gone. Ethan looked at Hayes. Understanding passed between them without words. This was their chance. Not just to save Emma, but to catch Stone and his accomplices in the act. We'll need more men, Hayes said, and we'll need to move fast. Sister Margaret, can you get us into the convent? We need those ledgers before the meeting. She nodded. There's a servant's entrance on the east side. I can leave it unlocked at 9 o'clock. They spent the next hour planning. Hayes's 3 deputies arrived hardened men who'd seen combat and wouldn't flinch when things got dangerous. Marcus Cole, 40, had been a locksmith before the war. Owen Reed, 38, was a sharpshooter. Frank Dawson, 25, had survived Sherman's march and had steady nerves that nothing seemed to shake. The plan was simple but risky. They would split into 2 groups. Hayes and 2 deputies would infiltrate the convent to secure the ledgers. Ethan and Frank would position themselves near the cabin to rescue the children when Stone arrived with them. As the sun began to set, they mounted their horses and rode north. The moon was a thin crescent, providing just enough light to see by, but not enough to betray their presence. They rode in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. Ethan thought about Benjamin, about the letter he'd written that morning. He thought about Catherine, wondering if she was watching from wherever the dead went, if she approved of what he was doing. Most of all, he thought about Sarah, about the trust she'd placed in a stranger, and the little girl named Emma, who didn't know rescue was coming. St. Helena's convent loomed against the night sky like a medieval fortress. It was a massive 3-story structure of gray stone with tall windows that reflected the moonlight like watchful eyes. A stone wall surrounded the compound, and beyond it Ethan could see the lights of the orphanage dormitory. They split up half a mile from the convent. Hayes's group circled around to the east entrance. Ethan and Frank continued north toward the cabin, following a rough logging road that wound through dense pine forest. The cabin appeared suddenly nestled in a small clearing. It was dark and seemingly abandoned, but fresh wagon tracks in the mud told a different story. Someone had been here recently, preparing. Ethan and Frank tethered their horses in the trees and moved closer on foot. Frank positioned himself on high ground with his Sharps rifle, while Ethan found cover behind a fallen oak that gave him a clear view of the cabin's entrance. And then they waited. Back at the convent, Hayes and his men were making their approach. Sister Margaret had been true to her word. The east door stood slightly ajar, and they slipped inside like shadows. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps, and they could hear the distant sound of evening prayers from the chapel. Margaret led them through narrow servants' quarters up a back stairway to the 3rd floor. Stone's office was at the end of a long hallway, its heavy oak door locked tight. Marcus made quick work of it, his thin metal picks finding the mechanism in under 2 minutes. The door swung open with barely a whisper, and they entered. The office was lavish, far too lavish for a man of God. Thick carpets covered the floor. A massive desk dominated the room, and behind it hung a large painting of Christ on the cross. Margaret pointed to it. Behind there, the safe. They lifted the painting down carefully. The safe was black iron, its face gleaming in the lamplight. Marcus knelt before it, pressing his ear against the metal, his fingers working the dial with practiced precision. Time stretched. Each tick of the clock on Stone's desk seemed to echo like thunder. Hayes stood at the door, watching the hallway, his hand on his pistol. Marcus's breathing was steady, focused sweat beading on his brow despite the cool night. Then a soft click. The safe door swung open. Inside were three leather-bound ledgers, each one thick with entries. Hayes pulled them out and opened the first one. Page after page of names, dates, amounts of money. Each entry represented a child, a life bought and sold like property. "Dear God," Marcus whispered, looking over his shoulder. But there was more. Bundles of cash, easily $15,000. Documents bearing official seals. And letters correspondence between Stone and powerful men throughout the South. Judges, politicians, wealthy landowners. The network was far larger than any of them had imagined. Not just St. Helena's. 14 institutions across 5 states, not just Stone and Crane. Connections that reached deep into the Richmond power structure itself. Hayes was stuffing the ledgers into a leather satchel when they heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy boots moving fast. They'd been betrayed or discovered. It didn't matter which. The door burst open. Marcus Webb stood there with 3 armed men behind him. His hand went to his gun, but Hayes was faster. He drew and fired in one smooth motion. The bullet caught Webb in the shoulder, spinning him around. The hallway erupted in chaos. Webb's men opened fire, and Hayes's deputies returned it. The confined space magnified every sound until it was like being inside a thunderstorm. Marcus took a bullet to the arm but stayed on his feet, firing back with his left hand. Owen tackled one of Webb's men, and they went down in a tangle of fists and curses. Hayes grabbed the satchel and ran for the back stairs, shouting for his men to follow. They fought their way down, exchanging shots with more of Stone's guards, who seemed to materialize from every shadow. Sister Margaret appeared at a side corridor. "This way, the catacombs." She led them down a narrow stone stairway that descended into darkness. Behind them they could hear Webb screaming orders, his voice raw with pain and fury. The catacombs were a maze of passages beneath the convent, cold and damp and smelling of earth. Margaret navigated them by memory, turning left and right until Hayes wouldn't have been able to find his way back if his life depended on it. They emerged in the woods half a mile from the convent, gasping and bloodied, but alive. Marcus's arm was bleeding badly and Hayes had a graze across his ribs, but they had the ledgers. "We need to get to Ethan," Hayes said. "If Stone knows we're here, he might change the meeting location." They mounted their horses and rode hard for the cabin, not caring now about stealth-only speed. At the cabin, Ethan had heard the distant gunfire and knew something had gone wrong. He gripped his rifle tighter, his eyes never leaving the clearing. Then he heard it, the sound of wagons approaching. 2 wagons emerged from the tree line. The first carried Reverend Elijah Stone and 2 nuns. The second held a driver, and huddled in the back, under blankets, 5 small shapes. The children. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. One of those shapes was Emma Sarah's little sister, the child he'd promised to save. A man stepped out of the cabin. Thaddeus Harrow, 55 years old, wearing an expensive suit that spoke of wealth and power. He was a state senator, a factory owner, a man who supplemented his income by purchasing children for his network of factories and worse. Behind him came 4 guards with rifles and pistols. Stone and Harrow shook hands like old friends. One of the nuns pulled back the blanket in the second wagon, revealing the children. 5 pairs of frightened eyes stared out at the world. Ethan could see Emma now. She was small for 8, with blonde hair that caught the lamplight like gold. She was holding the hand of an even smaller child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 4, trying to protect him even in her own terror. Harrow walked to the wagon, examining the children like livestock. He checked their teeth. Their hands turned them around to inspect them. Ethan felt rage building in his chest, like a physical pressure threatening to explode. "Satisfactory," Harrow said. $500 is agreed. 300 for the girl, 50 each for the others. Stone smiled. "Always a pleasure doing business with you, Senator." They were turning to go into the cabin when Emma did something that changed everything. She looked directly at the trees where Ethan was hidden. Her eyes widened and she whispered something. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but he saw her lips form them. Sister Sarah. Somehow, impossibly, the girl had recognized something. Maybe the scent of soap that Sarah used carried on the wind. Maybe just hope making her see what she wanted to see. But her whisper was loud enough for the nun beside her to hear. The woman's head snapped around, peering into the darkness. Ethan knew he was out of time. In seconds, they would load the children into Harrow's coach and disappear forever. He stood up from behind the fallen oak, rifle raised. "Nobody move." Every head turned toward him. For a frozen moment, the world seemed to stop. Then all hell broke loose. Harrow's guards went for their weapons. Frank fired from his position on the ridge, the crack of his Sharps rifle echoing across the clearing. One guard dropped, clutching his leg. Ethan fired at the nearest armed man, missing, but forcing him to dive for cover. He levered another round into the Springfield, fired again. This time he didn't miss. Emma screamed and pulled the younger children down into the wagon bed. The nuns scattered, running for the trees. Stone pulled a small pistol from his robes, his face twisted with fury. "Kill him!" Stone screamed. "Kill the farmer!" Bullets whined through the air. Ethan dropped behind the oak log as rounds thudded into the wood, throwing splinters. He returned fire, working the rifle's action as fast as his hands would move. Frank was doing tremendous work from the ridge, his Sharps speaking with deadly accuracy. Another of Harrow's guards went down, then a third. But there were still too many. Ethan was pinned down, unable to reach the children. He saw Harrow trying to get to the wagon to drive away with his cargo. That's when Hayes arrived. The marshal and his deputies thundered into the clearing on horseback, guns blazing. Hayes rode straight at Harrow, his horse's shoulder catching the senator and sending him sprawling in the dirt. The remaining guards, seeing themselves suddenly outnumbered, lost their nerve. Two threw down their weapons. The last one tried to run and took a bullet from Owen's pistol for his trouble. Stone was backing toward the cabin, still firing his little pistol wildly. Hayes dismounted and walked toward him, his own gun steady. "It's over, Stone. Drop the weapon. You have no authority here. I am a man of God. You're a slaver and a child merchant. Now drop the gun before I drop you." For a moment it seemed Stone might comply. Then his eyes found Ethan, and pure hatred flashed across his face. "You," he snarled, "you destroyed everything. Years of work, God's kingdom. You're not building anything for God," Ethan said, stepping forward. "You built it for yourself on the backs of children." Stone's hand tightened on his pistol. Hayes saw it coming and fired. Stone stumbled backward, a red stain spreading across his expensive robes. He fell to his knees, looking up at the night sky with an expression of disbelief, as if unable to comprehend that he could be defeated. This isn't how it ends," he gasped. "I had protection. Powerful friends." Hayes pulled one of the ledgers from his satchel and held it up. "Not anymore. We have it all. Every name, every transaction, every piece of correspondence. Your friends are going down with you." Stone's eyes glazed over and he slumped forward into the dirt. But Ethan didn't wait to watch him die. He ran to the wagon where the children huddled, terrified by the violence they'd witnessed. "Emma," he said softly. "Emma Mitchell." The blonde girl looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm a friend of your sister Sarah. She sent me to bring you home." At the name Sarah, something broke in the child's face. Tears began to flow. "Sister Sarah, she's alive. They said she was dead. She's very much alive, and she's waiting for you." Emma threw her arms around Ethan's neck, sobbing into his shoulder. The other children clung to each other, not understanding what had happened, but sensing that the nightmare might be over. Hayes was rounding up the prisoners. Harrow was on his knees, his fine suit covered in dirt, his face pale with shock. Webb, wounded but alive, sat against a tree, clutching his shoulder. "We need to get these children to safety," Hayes said. "And we need to get this evidence to Richmond before Crane can interfere." As if summoned by his name, a new sound reached them. Hoofbeats, many of them. From the South Road came riders, at least a dozen of them. Leading them was Judge Nathaniel Crane, his face a mask of rage. "Marshal Hayes," he shouted, "you are under arrest for unlawful entry, assault, and kidnapping. Release those prisoners immediately." Hayes's men spread out, forming a line. They were a mix of deputies and hired guns, all armed, all looking ready for a fight. The odds had just turned very bad. Hayes had 5 men, 3 of them wounded. Crane had 12, all fresh and eager. Ethan moved to stand beside Hayes, his rifle ready. Frank climbed down from the ridge to join them. Even Marcus and Owen, wounded as they were, took positions. "This is madness," Crane said, though there was uncertainty in his voice. "You're all going to die for nothing." "Not for nothing," Ethan said. "For them." He gestured to the children in the wagon. Emma was standing beside him now, her small hand clutching his coat. "For every child you and Stone sold. For every family you destroyed. That's not nothing." Crane's face reddened with anger. "You're a farmer, Blackwell. A nobody. You think you can stand against me, against the system? For a moment, Crane's mask slipped. I have a son the same age as that boy of yours. I wanted to give him a future. After the war, everything was changing. I had to make hard choices. Maybe I am nobody, Ethan replied, but I'm a nobody who keeps his promises. And hard choices. You chose to sell children. That's not hard, that's evil. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Fingers touched triggers. Men barely breathed. Then from the darkness behind Crane's line came new voices, familiar voices. Judge Crane. Ethan's heart leaped. It was old Joe Tucker, and he wasn't alone. Riding out of the trees came 30 farmers from the valley, all armed, all grim-faced. And behind them impossibly came Benjamin and Sarah. His son sat on a horse beside the woman they'd saved, both of them armed and ready to fight. Old Joe rode to the front, his ancient Sharps rifle cradled in his arms, the flag of the United States tied to his saddle. Judge Crane, Joe called out, his 70-year-old voice still strong. These men are our neighbors, our friends. You want to arrest them? You'll have to go through all of us. The farmers spread out surrounding Crane's men. Now the odds were very different. Crane looked around wildly, seeing his advantage evaporate. This is insurrection, rebellion against lawful authority. No, Hayes said calmly. This is citizens protecting the innocent. Now you have two choices, Judge. You can stand down or you can try to fight 30 armed men who are defending their homes and families. One of Crane's deputies lowered his rifle, then another. They were local men, farmers and shopkeepers, themselves not professional killers. They weren't going to die for Crane's corruption. Within moments, 6 of Crane's 12 men had laid down their weapons. The rest looked uncertain, waiting for their employer to make the call. Crane sat on his horse, his face purple with rage and humiliation. His hand moved toward his pistol. A shot rang out, not from any of the men below, but from the ridge where Frank had been positioned. Except Frank wasn't there anymore. Standing in his place, shaking but determined, was Benjamin Blackwell. The 10-year-old boy had fired his father's rifle, and the bullet had struck the ground directly in front of Crane's horse. The animal reared, throwing Crane from the saddle. He landed hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. Ethan ran to his son. Benjamin, what are you doing here? I told you to stay home. The boy's eyes were filled with tears, but also with pride. I read your letter, Papa. I was afraid you were going to tea. Miss Sarah said we had to help you. We couldn't just stay home. Ethan pulled his son into a fierce embrace, his rifle forgotten. Over Benjamin's shoulder, he saw Sarah climbing down from her horse. She was pale, still weak from her injuries, but her eyes were searching. Emma, Sarah's voice called out. When the little girl heard her sister's voice, she ran. They met in the middle of the clearing. Sarah fell to her knees to wrap her arms around the child she thought she'd lost forever. Their sobs of joy cut through the tension like a knife, reminding everyone what this fight had really been about. Hayes moved to where Crane lay in the dirt, coughing and gasping. The marshal pulled out iron shackles. Judge Nathaniel Crane, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, corruption, and abuse of office. You'll be tried in federal court in Richmond. Crane looked up at him with pure hatred. I'll be free in a week. I have friends, powerful friends. Hayes pulled one of the ledgers from his satchel and dropped it on Crane's chest. Not after they see this. We have everything. Every name, every transaction, every piece of correspondence. Your friends are going to run from you like you've got plague. As Hayes's men rounded up the last of the prisoners, Ethan walked over to where Sarah and Emma sat holding each other. Benjamin followed suddenly, shy in the presence of such raw emotion. Sarah looked up at Ethan, her face streaked with tears. You kept your promise. You brought her back. I told you I would. Imam looked at Ethan with wide eyes. Are you Sister Sarah's husband? Ethan felt his face redden. No, I'm just a friend who wanted to help. He's more than that, Sarah said softly, her eyes meeting his. He's the man who gave us our lives back. As dawn began to break, warm light flooding the clearing, they made camp. There was too much to do. Too many prisoners to secure, too many children to comfort, to attempt the ride back in darkness. Old Joe stood leaning on his cane and addressed the gathered men. My granddaddy fought in the Revolution. My daddy fought in the War of 1812. I fought for the Union. We didn't fight so children could be sold like property in a free country. This, he gestured to the prisoners, is what freedom looks like when we fight for each other." The farmers nodded, their faces grim but proud. They'd come expecting a fight, and they'd won without firing more than one shot. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ethan sat with Benjamin, Sarah, and Emma. The children from the wagon had finally fallen asleep, watched over by Sister Margaret and the farmers' wives who had ridden with their husbands. Emma was between Sarah and Ethan, her small hand holding her sister's. Benjamin sat close to his father, the rifle he'd fired now set carefully aside. "What happens now?" Benjamin asked. Hayes, who was binding Crane's hands nearby, answered. "Now we take all this evidence to Richmond. The federal prosecutors will take over. Stone and Harrow are dead, but Crane and Webb will stand trial. And based on what's in these ledgers, at least a dozen other men will join them." "And the children?" Sarah asked. "We'll try to find their families. The ones who have families. The others?" Hayes looked at the sleeping forms. "We'll make sure they go to good homes this time." "Real homes." Sarah's hand found Ethan's in the darkness. He looked at her, saw the question in her eyes, the hope she was afraid to voice. "You and Emma," Ethan said quietly, "you'll come back to the farm. Both of you for as long as you need." "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. You're family." Benjamin nodded vigorously. "We have plenty of room. Emma can have the room that was supposed to be for my little sister. Mama would have wanted that." Sarah's tears started fresh, but these were different. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a future she thought was impossible. The story was far from over. The trials would continue in Richmond. The scandal would rock the state. Powerful men would fall, and their allies would seek revenge. But for this moment in the clearing bathed in morning light, 5 children slept safe. Justice had been served. And in a small farmhouse in the Shenandoah Valley, a family that had been broken was beginning to heal, finding in each other the strength to face whatever came next. The legacy they were building wasn't one of wealth or power. It was something far more valuable. It was the legacy of courage, of standing for what's right, of keeping promises even when the cost is high. It was the legacy of people who refused to look away from injustice, who refused to let fear silence their voices, who chose compassion over comfort. And that legacy would echo through generations long after the names were forgotten and the details faded. It would echo in every person who chose to stand up rather than stand aside, who chose to protect rather than profit, who chose love over hate. The journey to Richmond took 3 days. They traveled fast, changing horses, frequently avoiding main roads where ambush would be easier. Twice they saw riders shadowing them in the distance, but the 6 armed deputies Hayes had brought convinced the hunters to keep their distance. Richmond was a revelation to Benjamin and Emma, who had never seen a city before. Buildings 3 and 4 stories tall rose against the sky, streets paved with cobblestones stretched in every direction. Hundreds of people moved with purpose through the autumn morning. The war had scarred the city deeply. Burned buildings still stood as blackened reminders of what had been lost. But life was surging back, determined and relentless. They were taken to a federal building where rooms had been prepared. Not cells, but not freedom either. Protection that felt uncomfortably close to imprisonment. Jonathan Hartwell, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, briefed them on what to expect. He was a tall man in his 50s, with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much corruption to be surprised by anything anymore. "The trial begins in 2 weeks, Hartwell said, spreading documents across the table. "Crane is the primary defendant, but we're trying 6 others alongside him. Webb survived his wounds and has agreed to testify against Crane in exchange for a lighter sentence. With his testimony, the ledgers, and your account of the raid, we have them dead to rights." "What about the others named in the ledgers?" Ethan asked. "The politicians, the bankers. We're building cases against them. But Crane is the keystone. He connected the orphanages to the buyers, handled the legal paperwork, bribed officials. Get him and the whole structure collapses." Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan was coached on his testimony. How to answer questions clearly and concisely. How to handle aggressive cross-examination. How to remain calm when defense attorneys tried to rattle him. Sarah was called as a witness too, to testify about life inside St. Helena's convent, about what she'd seen and heard. The prosecutors warned her that the defense would try to destroy her credibility. They would bring up her body, her unsuitability for religious life, anything to make the jury distrust her. "Let them," Sarah said firmly. "I spent 10 years being ashamed of my body. I'm done with that. If they want to attack me for how I look, that says more about them than me. Benjamin and Emma were kept occupied by a kind woman named Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house where they stayed. She taught them city ways, took them to see the sights, tried to make the waiting bearable. The night before the trial, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stood at the window of his room looking out at Richmond's gaslit streets. Behind him, the door opened quietly. Sarah entered wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. "I couldn't sleep either," she said, nervous, terrified. "They're going to put me on a stand in front of hundreds of people and ask me to relive the worst moments of my life." Ethan turned from the window. "You don't have to do it. I can testify about what you told me." "That's hearsay. It won't carry the same weight." She moved to stand beside him. "No, I have to do this. For Emma, for all those children, for myself. You're the bravest person I know." Sarah smiled sadly. "I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid." They stood together in the lamplight, two people who'd been broken by the world and were slowly learning to be whole again. "Ethan," Sarah said quietly, "after this is over, when we go back to the valley, you said you wanted to ask me something." "I did. Can I ask you something first?" "Of course. Do you believe people can change, that someone who's been damaged can become whole again?" Ethan thought about himself after Catherine's death, hollow and going through the motions of living. He thought about Benjamin learning to trust again after loss. He thought about the valley itself, scarred by war, but healing. "I believe that broken things can be mended," he said. "Not made perfect again, not made what they were, but made into something new, something that's stronger for having been broken and repaired. I hope you're right, because I want to be whole again, for Emma, for Benjamin, and for you. You already are. You just can't see it yet." The trial began on a cold November morning. The courthouse was packed with people standing in the aisles and spilling out into the hallway. The scandal had gripped the state, and everyone wanted to witness the proceedings. Judge Marcus Thornton presided, a federal appointee known for his fairness and his intolerance of courtroom theatrics. The jury was 12 men, farmers and merchants, the kind of people who understood the value of a child's life. Crane sat at the defense table, still carrying himself with arrogance despite the chains on his wrists. His lawyers were expensive, brought in from Philadelphia men who specialized in defending the indefensible. Hartwell's opening statement was simple and devastating. He laid out the evidence methodically, the ledgers showing 2,000 children sold over 15 years, the testimony of Webb, who described in detail how the operation worked, the financial records showing where the money went. "This isn't a case about religious freedom or orphan care," Hartwell told the jury. "This is a case about slavery, about men who saw vulnerable children as commodities to be bought and sold, about corruption so deep it poisoned everything it touched, and about ordinary people who said enough, who risked everything to expose the truth." The defense's opening was all misdirection. They painted Stone as a lone actor, Crane as a dupe who'd been manipulated. They portrayed Sarah as a delusional woman with a vendetta. They suggested the ledgers were forgeries, the raid illegal, the entire case built on the testimony of criminals and liars. The first week of trial was technical. Accountants explaining the ledgers, handwriting experts confirming authenticity, federal marshals describing the raids on the convent and the cabin. Then came the second week and the human testimony began. Webb took the stand first, his shoulder still bandaged from the bullet he'd taken. His testimony was clinical, detached, describing the mechanics of trafficking as if he were discussing crop rotation. "We'd identify orphans who had no family, no one who would look for them," Webb said, his voice flat. "Reverend Stone would process the paperwork, make it look like legal adoptions. Judge Crane would sign off, making it official. Then we'd deliver them to the buyers." "What kind of buyers?" Hartwell asked. "Plantation owners wanting cheap labor, factory owners who didn't want to pay adult wages, others who—" Webb paused, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Others who wanted children for darker purposes." And Judge Crane knew about all of this. He orchestrated it, set the prices, vetted the buyers, took 30% of every sale. On cross-examination, the defense attorney savaged Webb, bringing up every crime he'd committed, every lie he'd told. But the core facts remained unchanged. Crane had signed the papers. Crane had taken the money. Crane had enabled everything. Then it was Ethan's turn. He walked to the stand, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then he told his story. He described finding Sarah by the river beaten and terrified. He described her wounds, the rope burns, the lash marks. He described what she'd told him about the convent, about Stone's operation, about her sister Emma. "And what did you do with this information?" Hartwell asked. "I went to Marshall Hayes. We planned the raid. We got the ledgers, and we saved the children. Why risk your life for strangers?" Ethan looked at the jury, at 12 men who worked with their hands and knew what it meant to protect those weaker than themselves. "Because my wife taught me that we're measured by what we do for others, not what we accumulate for ourselves. Because I have a son, and I wanted him to learn that some things are worth fighting for. And because those children deserve someone to fight for them." The defense's cross-examination was brutal. They suggested Ethan was motivated by desire for Sarah, that he'd manufactured evidence to justify his attraction. They implied he was an unstable war veteran prone to violence. They questioned every detail of his story, looking for inconsistencies. But Ethan had been coached well. He answered each question calmly, never losing his temper, never embellishing. Just the facts steady and unshakable. When it was Sarah's turn, the courtroom fell silent. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back in a modest bun. As she walked to the stand, Ethan could see her hands trembling. But her voice was steady as she took the oath. Hartwell led her through her testimony gently. Her childhood at the convent, the changes when Stone took over, the children who disappeared, the day she overheard the conversation about selling Emma. "And they punished you for this knowledge?" Hartwell asked. "They called it punishment for stealing food. But everyone knew the real reason. I knew what they were doing, and they couldn't allow that." "What was the punishment?" Sarah's voice was steady but barely. 50 lashes with a leather strap, then locked in the cellar without food or water for 3 days. And after that, Deacon Webb came to the cellar. He said he was going to teach me a final lesson before I was executed for witchcraft. I fought him off with a piece of broken stone, took his keys, and escaped." Hartwell let that sink in before continuing. "Miss Mitchell, the defense is going to suggest that you invented this entire story because you were angry about being asked to leave the convent due to your physical appearance. What do you say to that?" Sarah looked directly at the jury. "I say that I spent 10 years being told my body was a curse, that I was somehow to blame for how I looked. I believed them for a long time. But then I met people who saw me as a human being, not as a source of shame or desire. And I realized the curse wasn't my body. The curse was the cruelty of men who used religion to justify their evil." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Crane's lawyers seemed momentarily at a loss. On cross-examination, they tried to destroy her. They asked invasive questions about her body, her measurements, whether she'd used her appearance to manipulate men. They suggested she'd been intimate with Ethan, that her testimony was payment for his protection. Through it all, Sarah remained composed. When they asked particularly offensive questions, she would pause, look at the lawyer calmly, and say, "I don't see what that has to do with children being sold." After 3 days of testimony, both sides rested. In his closing argument, Hartwell brought it all together: the evidence, the testimony, the undeniable pattern of corruption and cruelty. "The defense wants you to believe this is complicated," he told the jury, "that there are shades of gray mitigating circumstances. But it's not complicated. Children were sold, money was made, men in power enabled it. Judge Crane was at the center of everything. The evidence is overwhelming. The only question is whether you have the courage to hold a powerful man accountable." The defense's closing was a masterpiece of misdirection and appeals to authority. They portrayed Crane as a victim of circumstance, a man who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to have his life destroyed. They attacked the credibility of every witness, suggested reasonable doubt at every turn. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. Ethan spent that time pacing, unable to eat or rest. Sarah sat with Emma, reading to her, trying to maintain calm. Benjamin watched his father with worried eyes, understanding more than anyone gave him credit for. When the jury filed back in, their faces gave nothing away. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Thornton asked. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, how do you find guilty?" The courtroom erupted. Crane's face went white. His lawyers immediately called for a mistrial, claiming jury tampering, improper evidence, anything they could think of. Judge Thornton gavelled them to silence. On the charge of corruption of public office, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. 12 charges, 12 guilty verdicts. Crane sat motionless as his world collapsed around him. At sentencing a week later, Judge Thornton showed no mercy. "You held a position of trust," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You were given power to protect the vulnerable, and instead you exploited them in the most heinous way imaginable. You sold children. You destroyed families. You corrupted the very institutions meant to provide safety and care. For these crimes, I sentence you to life imprisonment at hard labor. May God have mercy on your soul, for this court has none." Crane was led away in chains. As he passed Ethan and Sarah, he stopped, looked at them with pure hatred. "This changes nothing," he has said. "The system is still rotten. There will be others." "Maybe," Ethan replied, "but there will also be people willing to stop them. Always." The other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years. Webb, who'd cooperated, got the lightest sentence, but would still spend a decade in prison. More importantly, the scandal triggered investigations across the South. 14 orphanages and convents were raided. 217 children were rescued. A dozen politicians and judges resigned or were arrested. The network that had operated with impunity for 15 years was broken. 3 days after the sentencing, Ethan stood with Sarah Benjamin and Emma on the steps of the federal building. Hayes had arranged transportation back to the valley. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that promised new beginnings. They rode out of Richmond as the city was waking, the streets still quiet. The journey home was quieter than the journey out. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, processing everything that had happened. When they crested the final hill and the valley spread out before them, Ethan felt something release in his chest. Home. Battered but still standing. The farm was exactly as they'd left it. The neighbors had kept their word, maintaining everything, even planting winter wheat so there'd be a crop come spring. Old Joe was there to greet them, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "Welcome home, son," he said, gripping Ethan's hand. "You did good, real good." That night, with Benjamin and Emma asleep upstairs, Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch. 6 months had passed since he'd found her by the river. 6 months that felt like 6 years, so much had changed. The valley was peaceful under the stars. In the distance, a few lights still burned in farmhouses where neighbors lived their quiet lives. The mountains stood watch, as they always had, ancient and patient. "Sarah," Ethan said, "I have a question to ask you, the one I said I'd ask when this was over." She turned to face him, and in the lamplight, he saw a woman transformed. Still carrying scars always would, but no longer broken, no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what she'd chosen to become. "I'm not a romantic man," he continued. "I don't have fancy words or grand gestures. I'm a farmer with a small piece of land and a son to raise. But I love you. I love your strength, your courage, the way you've brought life back to this house. I love the way you teach Emma to read, the way you've helped Benjamin heal from losing his mother. And I want to build a life with you, not to replace what either of us has lost, but to create something new." He pulled a simple silver ring from his pocket. It had belonged to Catherine, but he'd had it sized down to fit Sarah's smaller finger. He'd asked Benjamin's permission first, and the boy had given it enthusiastically. "So I'm asking Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Do you remember what I said that first night? That I already knew my answer." "I remember. It hasn't changed. Yes, Ethan. Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger. "It's not much. It's perfect. It's a promise, and that's worth more than any diamond." They married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Valley Church. The same neighbors who'd stood watch during the siege filled the pews. Old Joe gave Sarah away, having appointed himself her honorary grandfather. Benjamin stood as his father's best man, while Emma served as Sarah's maid of honor. The minister, a young man who'd only recently arrived in the valley, spoke about how God brings people together in unexpected ways, how love can bloom even in the darkest soil. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause. It wasn't just a wedding they were celebrating. It was survival. It was justice. It was the triumph of ordinary people over extraordinary evil. The reception was held at the farm. Tables were set up in the yard. Food was contributed by every family in the valley. There was music and dancing laughter and joy. For one day, the darkness of the past months was forgotten. As the sun set, Ethan and Sarah stood together watching their neighbor celebrate. Benjamin was teaching Emma to dance, both of them laughing as they stepped on each other's feet. Old Joe sat with the other veterans, swapping war stories and lies. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked. Sarah leaned against his shoulder. "I didn't think I'd ever be happy again. But yes, I am." "Any regrets?" "Only that we can't get back the years we lost. But maybe that's the point. We can't change the past, but we can build the future we want." The months passed in quiet contentment. Through winter's cold and spring's renewal, their love deepened. Sarah tended the garden Catherine had planted, teaching Emma the names of herbs and flowers. Benjamin grew taller, his voice beginning to deepen. Ethan found himself laughing again, a sound he thought he had lost forever. A year after their wedding in the spring of 1867, Sarah gave birth to a daughter. They named her Catherine Sarah Blackwell, after the two strongest women in Ethan's life. Benjamin, now 11, took to his role as big brother with enthusiasm. Emma officially adopted as Ethan, and Sarah's daughter proved to be a natural with the baby. The farmhouse that had once echoed with silence and grief now rang with children's laughter and the sounds of a family rebuilt. The farm prospered. With Sarah's help, they expanded the garden, added more livestock, purchased an additional 40 acres from a neighbor who was moving west. The valley itself was recovering from the war. New families were moving in. Old wounds were slowly healing. Sister Margaret's school flourished, educating children who'd once been destined for orphanages. Several of the children rescued from St. Helena's came to live in the valley, adopted by families who would actually care for them. The trials continued in Richmond. Based on evidence from Crane's case, 18 more people were convicted. The trafficking network was truly broken. Though Ethan knew Crane had been right about one thing: there would always be evil in the world. But there would also always be people willing to fight it. Years turned into decades. Benjamin grew to manhood and married a girl from the next valley over. They built a house on the 40 acres Ethan had purchased and started a family of their own. Emma became a teacher, working alongside Margaret to educate the next generation. She married a kind man who owned the general store in Harrisonburg, and they had 3 children who visited the farm every Sunday. Catherine Sarah grew up strong and fearless, a perfect blend of the 2 women she was named for. She had her mother's courage and her namesake's gentle wisdom. When she was old enough, she became a nurse tending to the sick throughout the valley. Ethan and Sarah grew old together, their love deepening with each season. The scars from their past never fully faded, but they learned to carry them with grace. Proof of battles fought and won. And now, in the autumn of 1895, Ethan sat on his porch with his grandson Daniel, the circle completing itself. The old man closed the journal and looked at the boy. 30 years had passed since that September morning when he'd found Sarah by the river. 30 years of building a life, raising children, watching grandchildren grow. "That's the story, Daniel," Ethan said. "That's what happened the year I was 36, the year everything changed." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd heard. Finally, he asked, "And you'd do it all again?" Ethan smiled, thinking of Sarah inside preparing dinner. Still beautiful after 30 years of marriage. Thinking of his children and grandchildren, all of them carrying forward the legacy of courage and compassion. "In a heartbeat," he said, "because some things are worth fighting for. Worth dying for if it comes to that. Family, justice. The simple idea that every person, no matter how small or powerless, deserves protection and dignity." He leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Daniel, in 1 week you leave for military service. You're going to see things that test everything you believe. Remember this: the easy path and the right path are usually not the same. Honor is not about what you say, it's about what you do when no one is watching." The boy nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in his young eyes. "What happened after the trial?" Daniel asked. "How did things change?" Ethan gestured toward the valley. "Crane died in prison 5 years into his sentence. Webb served his time and surprisingly became a preacher in a small town in Tennessee. A real one this time, helping people instead of hurting them. The children we saved most found families. Some stayed in the valley. A few I still see from time to time, grown now with children of their own. And the bigger changes. The scandal led to reforms. New laws about orphanages and adoption. federal oversight of child welfare institutions. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was better. And sometimes better is all we can hope for. Inside, they could hear Sarah calling that dinner was ready. Benjamin and his family had arrived. Emma and her husband were there too. Catherine Sarah had brought her fiancé to meet the family. 3 generations were gathering around the table just as they did every Sunday. One more thing, Daniel, Ethan said, standing with the creaking joints of age. When you're out there in the world, you're going to face hard choices. The easy things are to follow orders, don't ask questions, protect yourself first. The right things are to stand for the weak question, unjust orders, put others before yourself. The choice you make will define not just who you are, but who your children become. They walked inside together. The house was warm with lamplight and the smell of Sarah's cooking. The table was set for 15 people, 3 generations bound by blood and love and shared history. As Ethan took his place at the head of the table, Sarah beside him, he looked around at the faces of his family. Benjamin, now a father and grandfather himself. Emma, who'd been a terrified 8-year-old and was now a confident woman raising children of her own. Catherine Sarah, named for 2 remarkable women and carrying both their strengths. Old Joe was there too, 93 now, but still sharp as ever. Sister Margaret had joined them, retired from teaching, but still active in the community. Even Marshall Hayes, long since retired, had made the journey from Harrisonburg. Before they ate, Ethan stood to say grace. But instead of the usual prayer, he spoke from his heart. 30 years ago, he said, I made a promise to a woman I'd never met. I promised to protect her, to help her save her sister. I didn't know then that keeping that promise would change everything, that it would lead to this, to all of you. He looked at Sarah and she smiled, reaching for his hand. I learned that year that honor isn't about grand gestures or heroic moments. It's about doing what's right when it's hard, when it costs you something. When the easy path is right there tempting you to look away to stay safe, to protect what's yours and let the rest of the world burn. Benjamin nodded, understanding. He'd been 10 years old when this began. He'd stood watch with a shotgun. He'd fired a rifle to save his father. He'd learned these lessons young. The legacy I want to leave isn't this farm, though I hope it stays in the family. It isn't money or property or things. It's this. It's the knowledge that when you see injustice, you have a choice, and the choice you make matters. It echoes forward in ways you can't imagine. He looked at Daniel. You're going off to war. You're going to see terrible things. You're going to be asked to make impossible choices. Remember this table. Remember this family. Remember that we're all here because one day I chose to help a stranger. That one choice rippled outward and created all of this. Emma wiped tears from her eyes. She remembered being that terrified child in the wagon. She remembered Ethan appearing like an avenging angel. She remembered her sister's arms around her, safe at last. So when you're out there, Ethan continued, and you see someone who needs help, someone who's powerless and afraid and has no one else, remember that helping them isn't just about them. It's about everyone their life will touch, every child they'll raise, every person they'll help in turn. One act of courage can change the world. He sat down suddenly, tired. Sarah squeezed his hand. They ate dinner together, the conversation flowing easily. Stories were shared. Laughter echoed through the house. Children played while adults talked. It was an ordinary Sunday dinner, and yet it was extraordinary. It was proof that darkness could be overcome, that love could bloom in the hardest soil, that ordinary people, when they stood together, could move mountains. Later, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Ethan stood on the porch one more time. Sarah joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. Do you ever think about that morning, she asked, when you found me by the river every day? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you just walked away, if you decided it wasn't your problem? Ethan pulled her close. Never, not once, because then I wouldn't have you. Benjamin wouldn't have learned what it means to stand up for what's right. Emma wouldn't be teaching children. Catherine Sarah wouldn't exist. All of this, he gestured to the farm, the valley, the life they'd built, would be gone. I used to think I was cursed, Sarah said softly, that everything that happened to me was punishment for something. But now I think maybe it was all leading here, to you, to this life, to this family. Not cursed, Ethan said. tested, and you passed. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the valley, a dog barked. A child laughed. Life continued ordinary and precious. "What do you think happens to us?" Sarah asked. "After. Do you think Catherine is watching? Do you think she approves?" Ethan thought about his first wife, about the life they'd had, and the life that had been cut short. "I think she'd be happy we found each other. I think she'd love seeing Benjamin grown into a good man. I think she'd adore her namesake. I hope so. I hope she knows I never tried to replace her, that I honored her memory by loving her family. She knows." Inside, the clock struck 9. Time for bed. They were old now and the days were long, but they had each other and they had the knowledge that their lives had mattered, that they'd made a difference, that the legacy they were leaving was one of courage and compassion and standing up for what's right. As they prepared for sleep, Ethan thought about Daniel about to head off to war. He thought about all the young men who would face the same choices he'd faced. Stand up or stay silent. Help or walk away. Risk everything or protect what's yours. He hoped they'd choose wisely. He hoped they'd remember that honor wasn't about what you said, but what you did. That one person could make a difference. That standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, was the only way to live a life worth living. The legacy he was leaving wasn't measured in acres or dollars. It was measured in children saved, in injustice challenged, in a family built from the broken pieces of loss. It was measured in the values passed down through generations, in the courage to stand for what's right even when the cost is high. And perhaps most importantly, it was measured in the ripples. The endless ripples of one choice made on one September morning. The choice to help a stranger. The choice that changed everything. Sarah fell asleep first, her breathing slow and steady beside him. Ethan lay awake a while longer, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. From that riverbank to this bed. From strangers to soulmates. From broken to whole. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was always work to be done on a farm, always fences to mend, and crops to tend, and livestock to feed. But tonight he could rest, knowing he'd done what he set out to do. He'd kept his promise. He'd protected the vulnerable. He'd shown his son what it meant to be a man of honor. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters gently. The sound was familiar, comforting. The sound of home. Ethan closed his eyes and let sleep take him, secure in the knowledge that when morning came, his family would still be there. The farm would still stand. The legacy would continue. And somewhere in the endless river of time, the ripples of his choices would keep spreading, touching lives he'd never know, changing the world in ways he couldn't imagine, proving that one person making one choice at one moment in time could create waves that would never stop. That was immortality. Not living forever, but creating something that would outlast you. Something that mattered. Something that made the world a little bit better for having been in it. And in the end, that was more than enough. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and patient, bearing witness to the small dramas of human lives. In the valley below, lights winked out one by one as families settled in for the night. The mountains stood watch as they always had, as they always would. And in a small farmhouse at the heart of it all, two people slept. Their hands still joined, even in dreams, their love, a testament to the power of second chances and the strength of promises kept. The story was over. But the legacy would continue forever.